She was 13 years old and already a star. While other kids were worrying about school, she was carrying an entire industry on her back. Her voice sounded like a woman who had lived a lifetime of pain. But the truth was, she hadn't even lived yet. Tanya Tucker became famous overnight, loved by millions, watched by everyone. And then, she slowly disappeared. No goodbye tour, no final announcement, just silence. People assumed she fell off. Others whispered darker reasons. Some said she couldn't keep up. But listen to this. What really happened to Tanya Tucker is far more sad and far more complicated than anyone realizes. Because her story isn't about fame. It's about what fame does to someone when it comes too early. And once you hear what happened behind the scenes, you'll never hear her songs the same way again. But to understand how it all fell apart, we have to go back to the moment it all began. Before Tanya Tucker was old enough to understand what pressure felt like, she was already living inside it. At 13 years old, her voice wasn't just heard. It was trusted. It carried pain, longing, heartbreak, emotions most adults hadn't even processed yet. And that was the first warning sign. Tanya Tucker didn't ease into fame. She was thrown into it. One hit song changed everything. Suddenly there were tour buses instead of school buses, contracts instead of homework, strangers deciding what she should wear, say, sing, and feel. People called her gifted, wise beyond her years. But no one stopped to ask the obvious question. How does a child sing about adult pain without paying an adult price? Every night, she stood under bright lights singing stories of regret and lost love, while her own life was being written for her backstage. And the industry loved it. They didn't see a kid, they saw a product that sold records. There was no room to grow slowly, no room to make mistakes in private. Every move was watched, every misstep remembered. She learned early that applause could disappear at any moment, so she kept pushing, working harder, growing up faster. But listen closely. Growing up. Fast isn't the same as growing up safe, and while the world celebrated her success, something fragile was already cracking underneath. Because when fame arrives before identity, confusion always follows. And that confusion would soon turn into rebellion. But that wasn't all. Because once Tanya realized the image they built for her, she decided to fight back. People were confused by Tanya Tucker from the very beginning. Not because she lacked talent, but because her voice didn't sound like it belonged to a teenager. It sounded older, heavier, like someone who had already been hurt. That contrast made her unforgettable. Tanya Tucker would step on stage looking like a kid and sing like a woman who had already lost everything. Audiences were mesmerized, but behind the applause, something strange was happening. The industry leaned into it. They didn't protect her youth, they erased it. She wasn't encouraged to sing about innocence or growing up. She was pushed towards stories of betrayal, regret, and heartbreak. Songs that demanded emotional depth she hadn't lived yet. And night after night, she had to perform pain. At first, it felt like acting. Then it started to feel real. Because when you repeat a story long enough, your mind starts to believe it. Adults around her praised how mature she was. But maturity isn't the same as stability. And no one taught her how to separate the stage persona from the real girl underneath. She learned one dangerous lesson early on. That love came with conditions. That approval depended on delivering emotion on demand. And once that door opened, it never fully closed. But here's where it gets darker. As she grew older, the same people who admired her maturity began to judge her for it. Too bold, too wild, too much. The image they created was suddenly used against her. And that contradiction lit a fire inside her. Because if the world was going to label her anyway, she decided she'd choose the label herself. By the time Tanya Tucker reached adulthood, she understood something most people never do. If you don't control your image, someone else will. So she made a choice. If the industry already saw her as bold, dangerous, and unpredictable, she would own it. Tanya Tucker stopped trying to fit the mold they built for her. Leather instead of lace, attitude instead of apology. Songs that felt raw, fearless, and sometimes uncomfortable. To the public, it looked like rebellion. But to her, it was control. For the first time, she wasn't just surviving fame. She was pushing back. She lived louder, loved harder, refused to explain herself. And the headlines followed. High-profile relationships, late nights, a reputation that grew faster than the truth. People whispered that she was out of control. But listen carefully. You don't become wild by accident. You become wild when no one ever taught you how to be safe. The same industry that rushed her into adulthood now criticized her for acting like one, and the pressure never stopped. Every move became a story. Every mistake became a headline. There was no off switch, so she kept going. Faster. Harder. Because slowing down meant feeling everything she'd been avoiding. And that's when something shifted. The rebellion that once felt freeing started feeling exhausting. The image that gave her power began demanding a price, and what she turned to next would quietly change everything. At first, it didn't look dangerous. It looked like relief. A way to quiet the noise. A way to slow the thoughts. A way to survive the pressure that never stopped pressing. Tanya Tucker wasn't falling apart overnight. She was slipping. Slowly. The late nights became routine. The lifestyle became expected. And the line between coping and escaping started to blur. People around her called it rock star behavior. The industry shrugged it off. Fans didn't want the truth, they wanted the show. But listen to this. When you've been performing your whole life, no one notices when you're struggling for real. Her performances became unpredictable, sometimes electric, sometimes shaky, and instead of asking why, the world started backing away. That's when the silence crept in. Fewer invitations, fewer chances, fewer people willing to take a risk on her. At the same time, country music was changing. New faces, cleaner images, artists who felt easier to manage. And suddenly, Tanya didn't fit anymore. Not because she lacked talent, but because she carried too much history. Too real, too raw, too honest for an industry chasing perfection. Here's the part no one talks about. When fame pulls away, it doesn't feel like freedom. It feels like abandonment. And without the spotlight, everything she'd been numbing came rushing back. That's when she realized something terrifying. If she kept going like this, there might not be a comeback at all. So she made a decision that shocked everyone and saved her life. From the outside, it looked like she disappeared. But the truth is, Tanya Tucker stepped away, not because she failed, not because she was forgotten, but because she finally understood something critical. If she stayed, she might not survive it. There was no dramatic farewell, no press conference, no carefully crafted goodbye, just distance. For the first time since she was a child, there were no tour schedules controlling her life, no executives telling her who to be, no crowds demanding emotion on command, and that silence, it was terrifying. Because when the noise stops, you're left alone with yourself. This wasn't a vacation, it was confrontation. She had to face years of pressure she never chose, mistakes she never processed, a version of herself that existed only to please others. And it wasn't easy. There were moments when walking away felt like quitting, like proving her critics right, like letting the industry win. But listen carefully. This wasn't quitting. This was survival. She focused on healing instead of headlines, stability instead of success, clarity instead of chaos. While the world moved on, she rebuilt something more important than fame, herself. And here's the part most people don't realize. Walking away didn't weaken her legacy, it preserved it, because the woman who would return later wasn't chasing relevance. She was carrying truth, and when she finally came back, the industry wasn't ready for what she had become. For years, people assumed Tanya Tucker was part of the past, a voice from another era, a name tied to nostalgia, a story already finished. They were wrong. When Tanya Tucker returned, she didn't come back chasing trends. She didn't try to sound younger. She didn't pretend the years hadn't happened. She leaned into them. Her voice was deeper now, not weaker, heavier, carrying experience instead of imitation. And that's what stunned everyone, because the emotion in her songs was no longer performed. It was lived. This wasn't a comeback built on hype. It was built on truth. Songs about survival, about regret, about endurance. And suddenly, the industry that once turned away started paying attention again. Then came the moment no one thought would ever happen. Awards, recognition, respect. Not for who she was at 13, but for who she became after everything tried to break her. This wasn't a second chance, it was a reckoning. The same world that once rushed her into fame was now standing still, listening. And here's the real shock. She didn't need validation anymore. She already won the hardest battle. Staying alive, staying real, staying herself. Her return wasn't loud. It was undeniable. And once you understand what her story really represents, the ending hits even harder. Tanya Tucker's story was never just about music. It was about timing, about pressure, about what happens when the world asks too much too early. Tanya Tucker wasn't broken by fame. She was shaped by it, tested by it, and nearly lost because of it. She showed us that disappearing doesn't always mean failure. Sometimes it means survival. While others chased relevance, she chose truth. While the industry moved on, she rebuilt herself quietly. And when she returned, it wasn't to prove anything. It was to finish the story on her own terms. That's what makes this beyond sad and incredibly powerful. Because her voice didn't fade. It waited. And now that you know what really happened, the question is simple. How many other legends disappeared? Not because they weren't strong enough, but because they were never protected? If this story changed the way you see fame, leave a comment and share your thoughts. And if you want more stories the industry never tells you, subscribe now.